Hello. I think it is extremely important to differentiate between governments and people. And I say governments in the sense from every political system, whether they be democratically elected governments or totalitarian governments. I think this is a very, very important thing to take on board. Um, I remember the film The Odessa File. It's quite old now. It's from the 1970s, and it's basically about a German journalist who traces Nazi war criminals. And there's an old man in that, an old Jewish man who had survived Auschwitz. And they're looking at his diary just before he's found dead in I think it's a Munich apartment. Anyway, in the diary, he says, peoples are not evil, only individuals. And it's a good line because it's really a powerful testimony to the fact that people are individuals, they're not solely defined by nationality. Now, it would be naive to say that nationality doesn't form part of identity because it is impossible to escape the culture of our country. And incidentally, I don't think there's anything wrong with patriotism on balance. I mean, I don't deny I love my country. I love the United Kingdom, and I do sometimes feel very British in my heart and soul. It's just a strong feeling I have, and it's quite difficult to explain. But when I look around the world, the actions that governments take is one of the most polarizing things there is, um, and one of the most divisive things because whatever action any government takes is going to have its supporters and its critics. It's very, very rare that you have a situation where everyone supports it or everyone opposes it. Usually, that doesn't mean it's balanced, doesn't mean it's 50-50. Sometimes a particular government may be widely unpopular around the world, but will still have support. Um, so I think it's very, very important that we look at this for a second and consider, well, what is the implications that when a government makes a particular decision, it then has implications for the people of that country. Um, there's many topical examples I can think of, but one that comes to mind is when Western countries, specifically the United States and the UK, decided to invade Iraq in 2003. And to be honest, it's hard to use any other word because that's in fact what it was. Now, all the debates can be made about the rights and wrongs of that. That's not the purpose of this video. But I think even supporters of the intervention invasion would agree that it was a highly controversial situation. And I do remember there was a period in 2003 where the US, but also Britain, found themselves not totally isolated on the world stage, but not far off. And it was a time when there was a sort of collective shame about being British at that time. I remember that because there was a general feeling that we had really massively damaged our image. Now, to be fair, Britain has always been seen as a country that has been involved in military interventions, so it's not the first time we faced that sort of controversy. But, I remember there was certainly a sense of Britain and Europe feeling isolated. It's true that Italy was involved in that, but to a much lesser extent, and Poland. So it created great tensions with Germany and France at the time, and it's just one example. I also remember at that time there was growing anti-Americanism around the world. And unfortunately, that got to the point whereby it wasn't just hostility to those Americans who support George W. Bush, but hostility to Americans in general. And sometimes it was borderline extreme, this hostility that we saw. So that was very unfortunate. Um, and we have to be careful that that never becomes the tract of thinking. So, at a particular time when a particular government is controversial, for example, Russia, 2 years ago, when the Ukraine crisis was going on, Russia was pretty controversial around the world and pretty, yeah, pretty controversial It's certainly regained that now, and Putin's a very powerful leader. But I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm just using it as an example. Most powerful countries at some point find themselves making decisions that are highly controversial and somewhat polarize them on the world stage, um, in some way or another. Probably another example would be in the mid 1990s, France was going through a period of great scrutiny because of the alleged funding of the Rwandan genocide, but also the nuclear tests and the Greenpeace incident. I believe that was about, it may have been the late 80s actually. But the point I'm making is every country, especially bigger countries politically, go through periods of great scrutiny. Um, One of the reasons I opposed Iraq is because I felt that even as a 17-year-old, I looked at that as being hugely unwise to polarize ourselves on the world stage. Although nowadays I do think it's more complex than people make it out to be. But anyway, that's beside the point. Anyway, speaking for myself, there are governments I strongly dislike, put it plainly. At times I even detest. So, for instance, I think of the Russian government, I think of the Chinese government, the Saudi government. They're just some examples, and this is my personal opinion. It's not, I'm not going to pretend that I feel exactly the same way about every government because I don't. Okay, I'd be lying if I said I felt the same about the Canadian government as I did about the Russian or Chinese government. I just don't. So I'm not going to lie about things. But when I say I detest the Russian government or Russian state media or whatever, I want it to be understood that that is not the same as saying I dislike 145 million Russian people. Generalizations are boneheaded. That's common sense. Um, and unfortunately, sometimes people are all too quick to demonize an entire nationality. I remember when I was in China, there was a market and it was selling these t-shirts. One of them actually depicted a Japanese soldier in World War II outfit, with devil horns and a devil's tail, and he was sort of eating a piece of china like a vampire. And unfortunately, there is quite a lot of that mentality still around. Now, there's understandable reasons because of Japanese war crimes and all the rest of it. But by the same token, I know young Chinese who go to Japan who enjoy Japanese anime and Japanese style, and that thought wouldn't occur to them. So we also have to be careful not to get into the thinking that because there is xenophobia from some quarters doesn't mean it's universal. I honestly believe in every country there are open-minded people, even in North Korea. What one mistake we can make with North Korea is assuming that all the people there are by nature subservient, um, slaves of the totalitarian regime. But in different circumstances, I am convinced they would be just like people anywhere else in the world. I'm sure young North Koreans want to listen to music, they listen to pop stars. Um, there's the same fundamental human emotions everywhere in the world. Of course, there's cultural differences, sometimes profoundly so, and sometimes the cultural differences can be to an extent that are quite alien. So, for instance, as someone coming from a liberal Western country, it's alien for me that people would justify someone being stoned to death for blasphemy. That I can't get my head around that. But nevertheless, there are some basic human emotions that can be found everywhere. Anger, love, sadness, jubilation, they can be found everywhere. That is truly universal. So the point I'm making is that it is very, very important to not see a government as the same as people. Now, obviously, there is some chinks in this argument. For instance, in situations where there are totalitarian governments, more often than not, you do get a stronger sense of nationalism. Something I've noticed. For instance, with China, it is an authoritarian government, and I notice often when foreigners criticize China, there is a nationalist backlash, especially online. This is something I've talked about many times. Does that mean all Chinese people are hardcore communists? Of course not. In fact, ironically, a lot of the people enthusiastically defending the Communist Party, when they speak to other Chinese, they're probably not that bothered about it. It's just because a foreigner has said something. So there's this kind of protectionism in the sense of that person's attacking my government, therefore it's attack on my country. And unfortunately, it's that issue of not differentiating between a government and a country. And in the case of China, that is because it's a government that has absolute power. It's not a democracy. So after the Chinese Civil War, the Kuomintang went to Taiwan. They see themselves as the legitimate Chinese government. Um, Taiwan has went through its own democratic process subsequently. But the point I'm making is that in situations where there's more authoritarianism, it's harder for people to differentiate between a government and a country because the authoritarian government in charge goes out of its way to convince people that they are one and the same. So, for instance, the Chinese Communist Party say, "We are China," okay? Notwithstanding the fact that they're less than 100 years old and China is one of the world's most ancient civilizations. So, this is something that's very noticeable. And I do think that's very unfortunate that there is that nationalist attitude. And it isn't just China, there's many other examples. You do get it from some Americans, you get it from some Brits. Um, the difference I would argue though is that notwithstanding Donald Trump, with with totalitarian governments, the central government actually actively promotes that sense of nationalism. I find in Western countries you get that to a much lesser extent. You would never see Angela Merkel saying to German people, "Oh, go around the world and promote German nationalism." That would be unthinkable, given German history. Um, and you wouldn't even get it with Britain or France that much. With China, you do. You actually get nationalism in the education system. So no wonder young Chinese sometimes get quite close-minded online. Not talking about everyone, but it's definitely something that's noticeable, and that's unfortunate. So the only caveat to that argument about differentiate between countries and people, excuse me, differentiate between governments and people, is when people become kind of when they want to give a voice to a government. So in other words, if I make a video defending the British government and I go out of my way to defend the British government, I couldn't really complain if someone turned around and then attacked my Britishness because I'm speaking in the format of defending the British government. Likewise, if a Chinese nationalist vociferously defends the Chinese government or an American hardline patriot, whatever you want to say, whatever way you want to describe it, vociferously defends, say, gun laws in a particular state, they can't turn around and complain and say, "Oh, you're being racist" or whatever, because if you're going to if you're going to give a voice to a government, then you have to accept that the nationality factor is part of that. But I'm not going to just go up to a Chinese person and say, "Oh, I dislike you because I dislike the nationalist attitude of some of your compatriots, or I dislike your government." Why am I not going to do that? Because I don't know the person. And I know for a fact from personal experience that not all Chinese are ultra nationalists. They're just not. The problem is negative people get more attention than positive people. So if you get, say, someone from country X waving their flag and barking about how wonderful the country is and no foreigner can offend us or question us, they're going to get more attention than the same person or someone from that country who's going around the world and being open minded and not, taking every opportunity to defend the government. And that's just a point I would make. Um, if you genuinely believe that what your government is doing is right, then stand by your conviction and defend it. But don't defend your government just because you think you have to. That's stupid. That is not independent minded, and it makes you a useful idiot, to be quite blunt about it. I do occasionally defend the British government, but it's because I genuinely believe what I'm saying. I genuinely believe in that position. There's also times I criticise the British government. To me, it isn't about the fact that British, it's about whether I agree or disagree. Now, in all honesty, do most people have a slight instinctive defensiveness when the country's attacked? Probably. So, if all truth be told, if someone was attacking the British government, admittedly, part of me would probably be a little bit reactionary and want to defend my country's image. But I also am acutely aware that if I then become a blind nationalist and say, "Oh, how dare you say this?" That's a mistake. So I really try hard to avoid doing that. Um, so that's it. There's numerous things to think about there. All I would say to people, wherever you are in the world, if you genuinely agree with what your government's doing in foreign policy, that's fine. So stand by your conviction. But don't defend your government just because you feel you have to. That isn't open minded. Um, Also, I don't want people to think I'm focusing on any particular country. I've just mentioned some well known examples, but this can be applied anywhere. So, I strongly dislike what Russia's doing right now. I strongly dislike RT, I've made that clear, but I'm not going to hate all Russian people because of that. In fact, my impression of the Russian people is quite a positive one on an individual basis. I find them to be quite modest and amicable people from what I've seen. I haven't known very many, in all honesty. I was quite good friends with a lady from Minsk, White Russia, but Russia proper, I haven't known many. But the impression I get from interviews and so on is that they're decent people and cultured people. Actually, they read a lot, and I'm never ever going to judge an entire nation by its government. I refuse to do that. Yes, there will be individuals I dislike, and yes, if I see displays of nationalism, I'm going to dislike those people. So I've been in run-ins, for example, with Chinese nationalists, and I didn't like them. They didn't like me. I didn't like them. It's a bit like the scene in Rocky Four when Rocky fights Ivan Drago at the end, and he says, "I came in here, and 20,000 people were booing me. And I guess I didn't know what to feel about that, so I didn't much like you none either." A little bit like that. Then in the end, he said, "Here you had two guys killing each other, but I guess that's better than 20 million." Obviously, he was talking about the Soviet era. That was sensitive, of course. The point is, I think they changed 25 times. Anyway, I honestly feel that nationalism is one of those things that divides people more than almost anything. And nationalism comes from a point of being overly defensive. I really believe that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people defending their country's image if they, it'd be a bit strange not to if you loved your country and someone was making unfair allegations against it and you kept silent. That would be a little bit, so sometimes people say things about the UK and they're just wrong. So yeah, I will intervene and say something. But as a general rule, it's very, very important to not be overtly nationalistic. I really, really believe that. When I meet someone, I don't care whether they are from Uzbekistan, the United States, Japan, China, Togo, Nigeria, South Africa, Saudi Arabia. I will treat that person as an individual. Now, if they come out with a particular opinion I don't like, and it might happen to be an opinion that is commonplace in that country, then yeah, I'm not going to particularly like them. But I'm still not going to generalize all people. As another example, Saudi Arabia. I may meet a Saudi who has a bad attitude towards gay people or towards women's equality. And I won't like that guy, but I'm not going to hate all Saudis and then say all Saudis think like this because I know they don't. This isn't political correctness either. It's just reality. It's just reality. In every country, yes, you might find trends. Okay, so a lot of Russians drink vodka. Um, a lot of Pakistanis hold conservative views on religious issues. Um, a lot of Americans like guns, etc. It does not mean this is universal. It just doesn't. So, thanks for watching. I really hope people take something from this. Thanks for watching and best wishes, everyone.